My name is Bob Hedden. I'm a consultant for the oil heat industry, and today we're going to talk about the new above ground tank rules that have just been released. This is the 2024 version. It's a improvement on the 2017 version. We've had to make some tweaks, and so we're going to bring you up to date with all the new changes, as well as what the existing laws that are still in place, and that's going to be our goal for today. The goals for these rules, why did we start these rules in the first place? And the purpose was to make sure that tanks get replaced before they leak. Okay, that's the whole thing, is we don't, a tank leak or spill is a disaster we don't want to have happen. And so we want to then install or replace the tanks in a way that they won't leak again. And we've made great progress in this program so far. In the 6 years since it's been in effect, releases are down by 30% and cleanup costs are down by a total of 46%. So this is definitely working. Over the past 6 years, thousands of Vermonters have received help from the residential above ground storage tank removal and replacement program. The funds for the cleanup and for the new tank replacements comes from the 1 cent a gallon tax on heating oil and kerosene. Now, this doesn't cover underground tanks at all. It's strictly above ground tanks. Underground tanks are a whole separate thing. It's strongly advised that you do not put tanks underground anymore. And for any existing underground system that is not double wall piped and double wall tank are of significant concern, and we really feel that you should get them out of the field as soon as is practicable. As far as releases, since the program started, actually, originally the rules were started in 2012, but they weren't mandatory. We didn't have red tags. It didn't really mean anything until 2017. But we do have records back to 2012. And as far as AST tank, failures, the tank itself, it goes from 80 failures in 2012 down to 31 failures in 2022. So there's been dramatic improvement in that. However, the AST line, the piping, the fittings, the filters, those sort of things, the numbers have stayed pretty stable, as you can see. They've been started at about 23, and last year there was 22. So we haven't made much progress there, and we want to do better with that. So we made some tweaks to the new rules to improve that. As far as tanks being knocked over by snow and ice falling off a roof, those numbers have stayed pretty stable. As a matter of fact, 2021 we set a record. We had 8 tanks failed that year, so that was the most we've had. So we wanted to do something about that in the new rules. We've also come across corrosion of fuel lines that are touching concrete. Originally we thought we would be in trouble if they were buried under the ground or under concrete, but we've actually found that oil lines just lying on a concrete floor will also corrode. And the numbers here again, it was 12 failures in 2012 and 12 failures in 2022. So we haven't made any progress there, and that's why we've made some changes to the rules in that area. Total incidents, however, in 2012 there were 115, and in 2022 there were only 66. So you can see there's been dramatic progress. In order to better understand the rules, I suggest you have copies of the 3 inspection checklists on hand to refer to as we go along. As far as oil company liability, it's still pretty clear. If you fill it, if you touch it, you own it. If you fill a tank, you're going to be responsible for that tank. All tanks should have been inspected at least once since the program started in 2017, because you're supposed to inspect the tank every 3 years. So therefore, we've had every tank that you come across should have been inspected by now, at least once. Inspections are required for new customers before the first fill and for existing customers. And now there's going to be a change. It used to be every 3 years. The state has given us some relief there, and it's going to be every 4 years. This is a big improvement for us, because we found 3 years we just didn't have enough time to get them all done. So the question that we get asked all the time is, what happens if there's a release before I do an inspection? Well, the answer is you've had the same liability you've always had. If you made a mistake, if you did something egregious, yeah, it's your fault, and the state's going to want to talk to you about it. There is the only clear-cut case where you are definitely liable is if you knowingly fill a tank that has never been inspected or has been red tagged by either your company or another company, and then you filled it. That is prohibited, and they will definitely be held accountable. You'll be liable for the release or cleaning up the spill, which could be $16,000 to $20,000, and the state can assess a financial penalty. If a company accepts a poor or incorrect third-party inspection and the tank fails for a reason that should have been caught by a proper inspection, the company that filled the tank is liable for the cleanup. As far as the rules are concerned, they are intended to protect the public health and the environment. That's the stated goal, by establishing the standards for the design, installation, and inspection of above-ground storage tanks, or we call ASTs. And any of them are used for any petroleum products, basically gasoline, diesel fuel, kerosene, heating oil. You can see from this picture that snow is starting to come off of the roof and hit these tanks. These two tanks, everything is wrong with the two tanks in these pictures, as you can see. They should have been red tagged for a whole lot of reasons. And you can see why we're going to start protecting for ice and snow, because the ice is and snow is about to come off the roof of this house and clobber those tanks. As far as release prohibitions and reporting, okay, these rules have really been in place for a very long time, and are actually holed up in other states as well. First, the release of hazardous material from spills or tank overflows into the surface or groundwater and to the land of the state is prohibited. Okay, you're not allowed to spill or have a release. If you do have one, you have to immediately report the release to the secretary. A release of any petroleum product that exceeds 2 gallons, that's the first thing you have to report. A release of any petroleum product that is less than or equal to 2 gallons, but poses a potential or actual threat to human health and the environment. And third, a release of any hazardous material other than petroleum. So anything labeled hazardous material is also covered by this prohibition. Okay, the suspected release. This is the tricky one, because you didn't actually see it dripping, but you think there may have been a leak in the past. The first way you could tell would be an unusual loss of product from an above-ground storage tank. So this would be someone who you thought you were going to make a 180-gallon delivery to, and they ran out of oil, or you delivered 275 gallons to that tank. Well, obviously they're burning oil faster than they were supposed to, and that should trigger a question on your part, what happened? And it could be that they just stopped using the wood stove. Could be that the heat pump wasn't keeping them warm enough and they turned up the thermostat. It could be that more people moved into the house and they're doing more laundry. Or it could be that the tank is leaking. And that's the one you have to kind of treat them all as if maybe the tank is leaking and maybe you should check it. The second is any strong petroleum vapors present in the vicinity of the tank. So if you have an oil smell in the basement, there should be no oil smell in an oil heated house. The fill is outside, the vent is vented to outside, and the boiler or furnace is vented to the chimney. So if there's an oil smell in your basement, there's probably a leak and should be taken care of. Or any other environmental conditions present around the tank, the facility, the valves, the filters, the oil burner, anything like that. So it could be stains on the floor, could be dead vegetation around the tank, it could be pink snow, because as you know, oil is dyed red. So if you have pink snow, that's a really bad sign. You have to report any of this under this subsection directly Monday through Friday during normal business hours, Waste Management Prevention Division, the phone number's on your screen, and anytime the Division of Emergency Management, and their numbers on the screen as well. The next thing you're required to do is if there is a leak, you have to stop the leak and contain it so it doesn't go anywhere else. For instance, one of the most important things if there's a leak and you discover it, unplug the sump pump, because you don't want the sump pump to pump the oil somewhere else where it's even going to be harder to clean up. So stop the leak, contain it. As far as if it's a leak on the ground, you could use the hose if you're a driver and you've suddenly had the tank tip over or something broke or your hose broke or anything. You can use the hose to kind of contain the spill until you can get help from the company to come with booms and absorbent materials and everything you need to clean up the mess. But the state definitely requires you to perform an investigation and corrective action. Okay, And also, emergency response, the Secretary may require an emergency response if determined that the release is causing an immediate or serious threat to the human health or the environment. And you can see from this picture, this is actually, yes, that's oil on a lake in the ice. And actually we got lucky in this because the lake froze and then it rained on top of the ice. And so there was a thin coating of water and then that froze. So there was there was ice and then water and then ice. And then the oil tank on shore tipped over and filled that space between the ice with oil. And that's what you see in this picture. So actually that wasn't as disastrous as it looked. That was pretty easy to clean up. Okay, so what is an above ground storage tank system? When we say that, we mean the whole system, right from the fill and vent all the way to the oil lines and to the valves, the filter, right up to the oil burner. That whole, all of the stuff involved with storing and delivering oil to the fire is part of this plan, is part of this program. Okay. And any petroleum product. So it could be gasoline, diesel fuel, kerosene, used oil, or heating oil are all covered by this. We do have an exception, and this is a change from the previous law, then that mobile and semi-mobile skid tanks are no longer included in the definition of an above-ground storage tank. If the tank has skids and it's meant to be moved from construction site to construction site for the diesel fuel for the bulldozers, that's called a skid tank. But a skid tank has to be moved once every 6 months. If a skid tank is sitting still and it's hooked to an oil burner, it's not a skid tank anymore, it's an above ground storage tank. So skid tanks have to move, okay? And if they do, they're not included. Now we do have two important new distinctions to the rules. The first one is defining existing tanks. Existing tanks are any tank that was installed before the new rules went into effect, which at this point is going to be July 1st, 2024. So any tank installed before that and is an existing tank, and there's a whole set of rules for that. There's also a new tank, and a new tank, of course, is any tank installed after July 1st, 2024. And we have much more stringent rules for those installations. So as we're going to go through, we're going to have different inspection forms for existing tanks and different inspection forms for new tanks. Another word that's important is in service. In service is a condition in which an above ground storage tank remains connected to a heating source and stores heating fuel that is required to heat the building or for distribution of a motor fuel tank. The definition applies to systems that use alternative fuels such as wood or electricity as a primary source and use heating fuel as the backup source. Another term where is now going to be important with the new rules is residential. These tanks, all above ground storage tanks, are included in these rules, but we have special rules for residential tanks. A residential tank is hooked to a building or structure where one or more persons live, whether year-round, seasonally, or temporarily. Examples of resident include, but are not limited to, single-family dwellings, duplexes, apartment buildings, mobile home parks, dorms, residential condominiums, and residential accessory units. A residential unit may include a commercial operation. For instance, I have an office upstairs in my house. Well, my house is still a residential house even though I had an office in it. So if you have a business, a little store downstairs, and you're living upstairs, that's still a resident. New tanks shall be made of materials compatible with the substance you're storing in. That's kind of common sense. And the most common is the single wall tank, not less than 12 gauge in thickness. And it says it right here on the end. It'll say 12 gauge thickness. And when we say 12 gauge, we mean the wrap, this part of the tank, and the head, this part of the tank. It all has to be 12 gauge. You can also have double bottom steel tanks. These are tanks that primarily Granby has started making, where they've just put a false bottom in the tank. This is because most of our failures we've found are in the bottom of the tank. We'll go over that, why that happens later. And so they thought if they put a false bottom in there, then if it started to leak, it would just leak into the space between the outside tank and the inside tank. And they put an alarm in there to tell you when that happens. Okay, so it needs that's called the interstitial space, the space between the inside tank and the outside tank. And you have to have interstitial space monitoring is required on these tanks. You can also have double wall tanks with polyethylene inner liner and a metal outer liner. These are Roth is the main manufacturer of these tanks, and Roth tanks are definitely allowed, and Roth tanks also have an interstitial space between the plastic inside tank and the metal outside tank. We also have double wall non-metallic tank. These are fiberglass tanks, and there's also single wall fiberglass tanks. Single wall fiberglass tanks are only allowed indoors, not outdoors. We're worried that lawnmower or something would throw up a rock, hit the tank, crack it, and make it leak. So all fiberglass tanks that are outdoors have to be double wall. Okay, the codes that govern our installations, we have primarily is NFPA 31, the 2020 edition. Okay, there's also NFPA 30 and NFPA Uniform Fire Code, NFPA 1. But this is the one that really pertains to pretty much everything we have. Or a similar method approved by the Secretary. If you think you have a better idea, if there's a new technology, you can write to the state and they'll look into it and let you know if they'll allow you to do that. One of the things that have always been in the rules, but haven't been enforced maybe strongly enough, is the foundation the tank is sitting on. Existing tanks, that's the ones that are out in the field now, have to be on a stable foundation. All above ground storage, it has to be a stable concrete pad would be ideal, or cap blocks or something along those lines. A stable foundation means the tank is freestanding. It's not leaning up against anything. It's standing on its own 4 feet. It isn't tilting in either direction, side to side, okay, or really front to back, except for we require it to have a 1/4 inch for every running foot toward the suction end. There's a tapping on the bottom of the tank, and it's required that it be tipped a 1/4 inch of every running foot toward that, so you could drain water out of the tank if any water built up in there. Okay. So that would be the only tipping allowed. Other than that, the tank's got to be pretty straight. And there's no evidence of subsidence. That's the tank is actually settling into the ground, and I'll show you pictures of that in a second. So there's no contact between the tank and the ground. The tank's got to be standing on its legs. The picture you see here, the tank is leaning sideways a little bit. It's on concrete blocks, hollow concrete blocks. That's not okay. They, as you know, dissolve in the rain over the years. And it's crooked. And you can see, I don't know why we always see when there's a tank you're not quite sure about, there's always a river or a lake in the background. In this case, a beautiful lake back there right next to this tank. So this tank, obviously, no good. That's not stable. Now, new tanks, this is where we go, the existing versus new. New tanks have to be on a solid foundation. Existing on stable, new tanks on solid. A solid foundation is a continuous concrete pad 4 inches deep that exceeds the length of the tank by 10% and the width of the tank by 10%. Okay, and for a 275, that would mean that you'd have to be 44 inches high. That's 44 inches high and 27 inches wide, 60 inches in length. The foundation footprint shall measure at least 4 inches deep, 30 inches wide, and 66 inches long. Okay? And you can see that's a good example in the picture of a tank on a solid foundation. This tank is mounted horizontally. You can also mount them vertically. That doesn't matter. It's just that's the way this one in the picture is mounted. We've also made an exception for bolted slabs over the years, and now that we've built them into the rules. There's a company that makes concrete slabs. They're about this big, and they bolt them together with a tongue and groove system and big, long stainless steel bolts. And that's been approved as a slab now for this. You know, it was always on a conditional basis. Now we put it into the rules that that's okay. So you can see the pictures. There's a tank is obviously tipping. That's not stable. There's another picture. The tank is sitting on boards and hollow concrete blocks. That's not stable. Picture on the left here, we have an interesting wooden structure for one of the tanks, and the other tanks is just kind of sitting on its belly on the ground. So neither one of them are okay. The picture on the right is interesting because it looks like it's on a dirt floor. If it is on a dirt floor, it's got concrete blocks on each leg. That is definitely stable, but it's not solid. So that one will be okay for now, but we'll talk about that later. It's not going to be okay in 2030, okay? And here's another example of that, stable but not solid. So this would be okay for an existing tank. It's not okay for a new tank. Okay, next thing we need to have on every job is what we call a vent alarm or whistle. And it's just a tin whistle that sticks down into the tank. It's bolted into the top of the tank. And when air goes through the whistle, it whistles, okay? And when the oil foams up, the oil foam hits the bottom of the whistle, the air can't go through the whistle anymore, and it stops, and the driver knows that to shut off and stop pumping. You can have freestanding whistles like this, or it can be built into your gauge. So we have here, this is a tank gauge, and here's the whistle hanging down, same thing, okay? And then the vent pipe comes out of here, okay? So these are required on new tanks now. Okay, the next thing about the vent pipe is the vent pipe shall terminate, okay, not more than 12 feet from the fill pipe, okay, and at a point visible from the fill pipe. So it could be actually around a corner as long as you can have your hand on your nozzle and you can lean around the corner and still see the vent. That's okay, as long as it's less than 12 feet. Okay, so it's 12 feet and visible. That's all, but it can be, on the side. Fill and vent pipe. All above ground storage tanks shall have a fill and a vent pipe with a minimum inside diameter of 1.25 inches. That's 1.25 inches. You can see as in the picture. And what you want to do is kind of everybody's hand is different size. In my case, my hand wraps around to the first knuckle. Okay, that's how big an 1.25 inch pipe is. Okay, so it has to be at least that big. As far as the material, back in the old rules, they kind of made a mistake when they wrote the old rules and didn't say that the tank, the fill and vent had to be metallic. And of course, people took advantage of that. And we ended up with PVC, polyvinyl chloride, plastic pipes, okay, fills and vents. And we ended up with even radiator hose. Somebody would replace a tank, and instead of getting a union and putting the pipe together properly, they would just hook a radiator hose onto the old vent and onto the new vent and call it done. That is not okay anymore. We've changed the rules. Fill and vent pipes have to be metallic, okay, on existing tanks. PVC and other non-metallic materials are no longer allowed on existing tanks or new tanks, okay. Now, new tanks have to be Schedule 40 steel or brass. They have to be threaded, okay. This is in other words, what we're saying is that copper fill and vents are not okay on new tanks, but they're not red taggable on existing tanks, okay. So it's 1.25 inch copper fill and vent on an existing tank is fine. You can approve that. It's just on the new tanks, because we have found that some people will hook their nozzle onto the oil driver and that the solder joint could fail and they have fallen off of tanks. So that's why we said we can't have copper anymore. Okay. The vent has to terminate with a waterproof cap. Here's one installed on a nice tight waterproof cap, so no water can get into the tank through the fill. The vent has to be a weatherproof cap, okay? Weatherproof, but it has to obviously let air out, because this is how the tank breathes, but it has to have a screen inside of it, okay? So weatherproof, insect-proof cap, okay? Now, 1.25 inch is the size for a fill and vent on the new tanks too, up to 660 gallon tank. Anything over 660, there's a schedule of sizes in the NFPA 31 book that tells you what the breakdown is for larger tanks. But I think residentially, I don't think you're going to put anything bigger than a 660 in somebody's basement. So the vent and fill the vent pipes have to have a screen. We find that, as you can see in the picture, Del Monte corn can is not an effective vent cap. That's not okay. If you don't put the screen in place, you could end up having this happen. This is the end of a tank. This is, you see in the picture, here's a tank, and this whole end blew out. The reason it blew out is because mud wasps crawled into the vent cap or vent pipe because there was no screen, and they built a nest. They're mud, which they build out of mud. I'm sure you've seen them, and it plugged off the vent. Oil tanks are not built to handle heavy pressure. They can only take about 10 pounds pressure tops. Okay, if you put an 1.25 inch hose from an oil truck and start pumping at 100 gallons a minute, you're going to pressurize this tank to way more than 10 pounds very quickly. And this just blew the weld right out of the end of the tank. The pressure got that high that quick. This was a very expensive mistake, okay, because they just didn't have a screen in the vent cap. Sorry, shutoff valves. You have to have a shutoff valve. On the new systems, not on existing systems, don't talk about shutoff valves at all. But on the new systems, they've sort of clarified the shutoff valve. They said on a tank located in the basement, the shutoff valve has to be within 12 inches of the bottom of the tank. So here's the shutoff valve installed right down there, okay? And that's where we'd like to have it. But we said, gee, on outside tanks, we asked the state, we don't really want to put shutoff valves outdoors because they'll freeze and break and people can turn them off and, all sorts of nonsense can happen. So the state has now said that, as you can see in the picture, if it's it's outside tank that comes off the top of the tank, the oil lines come off the top of the tank, that the shutoff valve can be in the basement before the filter. So between the tank and the filter is where you would locate that shutoff valve. And the valves have to be a type of valve that's designed for shutting off the supply of heating fuel, motor fuel, or used oil. Okay, the unused openings in the tank. Every tank comes with tappings in the top. Standard now is 4-inch caps. And when they come from the store, they come with just a plastic cap in here. And it's just a dust cap to keep rainwater out of the tank while the tank is being transported. Okay, you have to remove these plastic caps. Do not push it down into the tank, whatever you do. And they could be metal. This little skinny metal or plastic cap, remove it, and you have to use a threaded pipe plug and put the threaded pipe plug in there and make sure it's good and tight. Okay, this is a new rule and is now red taggable. Okay, we didn't mention this in the old rules and we had some problems. So every unused tapping on the top of the tank has to have a threaded steel plug in it. Openings in above ground storage tank systems that are temporarily taken out of service for maintenance or any other reason shall be plugged or tagged out to indicate the tank is out of service, and the fuel carrier shall be notified that the tank cannot receive deliveries. All new tanks have to have a gauge. Here we have a vent alarm and gauge. Okay, here's the vent and here's the gauge, and you can see the little red float. Okay, and this float goes up and down. Let me show you what it looks like inside the tank. Okay. We have a float. Now, if you can see when the float goes up and down, can you see the little red gauge goes up and down as it floats? See? This sort of thing. And we also have a whistle here. This is just a little tin whistle. It sticks down into the tank. The oil foams up, and when the foam hits the bottom, and so it's whistling. Okay, when the foam hits the bottom, the air can't go through the whistle anymore, and it stops whistling. So we know that the tank is full, and this is the vent here. One of the things you have to be careful of when inspecting it is this plastic cover for the gauge. make sure it's there. Make sure it hasn't been broken, because this would be a great place for rainwater to get into the tank, and we definitely don't want that to happen. Okay, piping and fuel lines, okay? All fuel lines have to have flare fittings, okay? Or threaded fittings if they're steel or brass. All existing tanks with piping and fuel lines that are buried underground shall be installed in a plastic coating or a continuous protective sleeve. As you can see in the picture, there's a picture of a plastic coated tank. It's the orange coating, and the sleeve could be water pump plastic. It could be some kind of conduit that's crush proof and rust proof. Okay. There will be no fittings under the floor for either the copper oil line, the sleeve, or the coating. Okay. But you have to be coated or sleeved. You don't have to be both on existing. On new installations, they have to be coated and sleeved. Okay, so on the new checklist, it's going to ask, are they coated and sleeved? On the existing checklist, it says, are they coated or sleeved? Okay, and they have to be a crush-resistant conduit. We asked about that. The state wasn't real clear on the definition for crush-resistant. I think it's something that if you step on it, it doesn't just stay crushed. It sort of resists being squashed, I think. So water pump plastic would be a perfectly good way to do that. But what has changed is the oil line just lying on the floor. It's above ground. It just comes out of the tank and lies across the floor to the burner. That has to be coated and sleeved too. Not just underground anymore. All oil lines, wherever they go, have to be coated and sleeved, because we've had corrosion just from copper. Copper and concrete don't like each other, and a copper line just lying on a concrete floor will corrode. Now, we found that out the hard way. Okay? So, no unprotected pipe, buried or in direct contact with earthen materials or concrete. As far as the tank location, okay, this one is also something that this is on the new tanks. For any above ground storage tank located inside a structure, so tank indoors, it has to be in the lowest level of the structure underneath its feet. So there's nothing under its feet but concrete and dirt, okay? Not a crawl space, not a space, any kind of space. It's got to be just ground and dirt, nothing else. Okay, it can't be up on the second floor, it can't be on the landing to the fire escape or any of the other crazy places we've seen it. New tanks located outside a structure, okay, have to be protected from physical damage from ice or snow falling off the roof. Now, compliance with this would require the system either be located on the gable end of the structure, obviously protected. There's no icicles on the pointy end of the house, right? Okay, so no problem on the pointy end. If you put the tank on the pointy end of the house, so there's no way that icicles can form above it, that's protected. That's good enough. But if you put it on the side where the eaves are, where the icicles can form, the tank has to be protected somehow with a roof, or it has to be a secondary containment structure or some kind of shelter, or if you've come up with a great new idea that you get the secretary to approve, you just send a proposal to the state. So you can see in this one picture, this is a tank enclosure. That's fine. The next slide, we have a homeowner built a really nice little roof for his tank. That's fine. It's just a little lean-to roof. The new Roth tanks actually come with their own cute little, roof on them. So any kind of thing to protect the oil lines and the tank from ice and snow falling off the roof. If you have more than one tank, this was a bit controversial, but this has been in the rules for a while now because we've had some problems, which I'll tell you about. And the rules say that if you have more than one tank, for each individual tank, you have to have a separate fill, a separate vent, a separate gauge and vent alarm, okay? And they all have to be piped outside, okay, the fill and vent. We asked the state, said, gee, that's a lot of holes in the house. Could we tie the vents together indoors and just have one vent go out through the wall. And the state said, yeah, okay, they would let us do that, as long as when you tie them together, the pipe going outdoors is one size larger than the other vent pipe. So if your vent pipes are 1.25 inches, then the one going out has to be 1.5 inches. If they're both 1.5 inches, then the one going out has to be 2 inches. Okay, and that the connection between the two vent pipes is higher than the lowest, where the oil fill hooks to the tank. So in other words, it's got to be higher than the top of the tank. The manifold has to be up here someplace. Okay. In this picture, you can see there's 3 parts to this picture. On the top, there's the little metal plug that I told you that comes with the tanks, and unfortunately, the installer just popped the metal plug down into the tank and it was a plastic plug in this case, instead of removing it. Then they piped it up, and in this picture, this is the way UL says you're supposed to, or NFPA says this is the way you're supposed to pipe up a 2-tank system. It has a big 2-inch crossover on top. And then you have the fill come in one tank and the vent goes out the other tank. That's okay with them. The problem is that on that tank that the fill is in, somebody popped the little plastic cap down in. The little plastic cap, this sounds unbelievable that this would happen, but over time in a lot of deliveries, anything can happen. The little plastic fill floated up, jammed the overflow between the 2 tanks, and it blew the first tank. Blew the end right out of the first tank. And this was in Dorset, Vermont. Dorset, Vermont has more lawyers per capita than I think any other town in the state. And the lawsuit was bloody. Okay, so we passed a rule that basically said this is not okay. So this is one of the cases where our rules, okay, the Vermont rules that we're talking about today, are tougher than NFPA. And the way it's written is that our rules will always take precedent over NFPA if they disagree, okay? And that's one case where they do. A new rule that we've come up with is that new tanks, we've had it in there forever, the new tanks, not existing tanks. New tanks shall have tank legs no longer than 14 inches because it's just too tall, it's too tippy. Where this happened is we had monitor space heaters, the kerosene space heaters, and they wanted to install the tank higher than the space heater so oil could gravity to the space heater and not have to be pumped. So they're trying to save money on the pumps, okay? And so people would build these ziggurats outside their house with the oil tank way up here on long pipes and all sorts of ridiculous arrangements, and they would tip over all the time. So the state said, no, that's not okay. But remember, that's only for new tanks. If it's an existing tank, the ridiculous piping is still okay, but you really want to talk to the customer about, you really should redo this, okay? But it's not red taggable, but on new installations, it absolutely is. It's got to be less than 14 inches. Okay, here's just pictures of bad tank legs, and all of these are no good. One of them is actually the old metal tank leg corroded, so they replaced it with a 2x4. Creative, but not okay. Date of installation. This has been in the rules since the beginning. What happened was when the state first decided they were going to write tank rules, they came to us and said, why don't we just do what the Canadians did? We'll just say every 15 years, you have to replace the tank. That's it. It's got to go. And we said, because we have no idea when the tanks were installed. We just don't. We don't know how old they are. There's no dates on these things. And so he says, it's just going to be a guess. And if you install a tank properly, it could last for 30, 40 years. Oil protects tanks from rust, really. Think about it. As most rust protectants are oil-based, So the state said, okay, well, we'll let you go for now, but from now on, we want to know when the tank was installed. So as of August 15th, 2017, when the first hardcore rules were passed, it's supposed to have the tank date painted on the tank someplace, or label, some kind of a permanent label on the tank somewhere obvious so people will know how old that tank is. I would definitely, on any new installations you make, be sure you put that on there. And I would recommend that maybe if you're going back on a tank you installed a few years ago, next time you're there on a service call, paint the date on the tank, because definitely that is required. Additional requirements for existing tank systems not later than July 1st, 2030. All tanks must have a couple things. First off, the tank foundation has to be solid. Second, the fill and vent. All above ground storage tanks shall have a fill and vent constructed of 40, Schedule 40. That's how thick it is. That's Schedule 40. Okay. Schedule 40 steel or brass. Tank piping and fuel lines. All above ground storage tanks will have fuel lines. If they are in direct contact with earthen materials or concrete, shall be protected and sleeved. Okay. And tank legs less than 14 inches or less. And all above ground storage tanks shall be protected from, outdoor storage tanks shall be protected from ice and snow. So these are now, remember, this is 2030, I said. So what we're basically saying is that all of the things we're requiring for new tanks, we're also going to require for existing tanks that have been installed before July 1st, 2024. All of those tanks that are out there in the field now have to be brought up to these standards July 1st, 2030. We picked back when we first started in 2017, when we first started this, we said, oh, that's 13 years from now, all the tanks will be replaced by then. Well, that isn't even going to be close to being true. Okay, so we will have to go back and retrofit a lot of tanks that are not installed this way. So this is a big deal. This is kind of the most hairy thing in the new regulations. And it's definitely a concern, but it makes sense. Okay, and that's why we said all new installations have to meet these standards now, because you're going to have to meet them in 2030 years anyway. Vermont has suffered some catastrophic floods in the last couple of years, starting with Irene and then a couple of thunderstorms, and we have some pictures here of the flood in July 2023, which knocked over a bunch of brand new tanks that we thought we were installing properly. And they got just blown right over, when the river came up and flowed through the house. Because remember, oil tanks are made out of steel. Same stuff you make aircraft carriers out of. The rules require that tanks in flood-prone areas must be tied down and the vent must extend above the projected flood level. We have to tie them down somewhere if you're in a flood-prone area. So that's the new regulations. Fill cap and everything, all of this stuff is all watertight because it doesn't let oil out. Well, it won't let water in. If you could keep the tank from floating away and you have the vent pipe above the flood, the tank could go underwater. Then when the water runs away, the tank will still be standing there and it won't have any water in it. So that's the idea behind this whole regulation. The second thing is the tank shall be anchored to a concrete pad. We figure, okay, maybe the tank being full of oil, it could still float. But if it's also tied to the cement floor in the basement, it's not going anywhere. Or if it's tied to that big 4-inch concrete pad that's 10% bigger than the tank, that gives it enough extra weight that we're hoping it's going to keep the tank down and keep it from floating. So the trick is you want to put foot flanges on. You can see these are on this tank, but this is what the foot flange looks like. Okay, and the nipple would, tank leg would screw into the flange. And you'll notice that the flange has holes in it. And what we want you to do is drill through these holes down into the floor and put concrete anchors and anchor the tank to the floor with the flanges, or anchor the tank to the concrete pad if it's outdoors. So that is the best way to do it. You're also allowed, and here's a picture, you can see them, installing that. We can also do tie downs, okay? If, you're worried about the floor or whatever, and you can put concrete anchors under the floor, or you can use earth augers or whatever. There's a couple different technologies, and then hold down straps with turnbuckles so you can tighten it up to keep the tank down on the floor. Flood protection is something we did a lot of work on in the industry the last couple of years ago. Hurricane Sandy hit Long Island and New Jersey and New York, and there's a lot of oil heat down there too. And that came just the year after Irene. And so the industry suddenly realized we have a serious problem here with floods. So the National Oil Heat Research Alliance got together, and they, through a lot of research, came up with recommended best practices for installing tanks in flood-prone areas. And you can go to the NORA website and order. NORA's come out with a great little booklet called Heating Fuel Storage Tanks Advanced is the name of it. And in it has the recommended practices for home heating oil tank installation in flood-prone areas. So that is available to you. You can go to the NORA website and get it. And also, this has been printed in the new NFPA. The NORA standards are in the back of this. Okay, same thing. So can show you how to go about doing this. There's a lot of different ways you can. As far as where is a flood-prone area, that's a really good question too. State's working on that. Right now, there's FEMA maps. You can go to, we'll show you the address will be on the screen of where you can find these maps, and also ANR, Agency of Natural Resources, Atlas has flood-prone areas located, in Vermont identified. Okay, so those are the rules. Now let's talk about how we go about inspecting to those rules. Now, first off is the inspections have to be done by the fuel carrier, the company that's delivering oil to the tank. It's their responsibility to see to it that the inspections are done. They are not allowed to deliver if they're not. So the frequency of inspections: an above-ground storage tank system shall be inspected the following times: immediately after an installation. Okay. You've just put in a new tank, or you've upgraded an old tank, you've made any changes, you have to inspect it before you do anything. And then you have to inspect it immediately after the initial delivery. This is very important because sometimes we found that there'll be an inside basement tank, and the installer got halfway done, went to lunch, didn't hook up the oil line to the bottom of the tank. The truck driver came, delivered oil, and dumped all the oil out of the brand new tank onto the nice cellar floor. So it's very important that on that very first delivery, somebody is basically in the basement watching while the driver delivers. And if something goes wrong, that somebody can go, and stop the driver from delivering so he's not pumping oil all over the floor. So that's a really critical inspection. It used to be that you were required to actually do 2 inspection forms, one when you were done with the installation and one after the first delivery. The state has made a change in that. We'll go over that in a little bit, made it a lot better. But it's still, you need to do those 2 inspections. You just do it on the same form now. Okay. The third time is prior to an initial delivery to an above-ground storage tank when the customer changes suppliers. So if a customer calls you up, says they want to be, or a person calls you, said they want to become a customer, you have to inspect the tank before you deliver to it. Okay? This is really important. You can't go out and just, oh, gee, I'm out of oil. You got to get here right away. Go out, stick the oil, and think you'll do the inspection the next day. No, that's not okay. You got to do the inspection first, because what you're going to find is a lot of people, an oil company went out, inspected their tank, red tagged the tank, okay, and the customer went down cellar, took the red tag off, and called you on the phone and said, hey, I want to become a new customer. Could you come and deliver? Hoping that you're not going to come check the tank. Okay, so it's imperative that you do that. Okay, and this is, so that's when the homeowner switches oil suppliers. And then if nothing else happens for your existing customers that have just been customers since the beginning of the law and are still a customer, every 4 years you have to go inspect that tank. This is a big change. The previous rules said every 3 years. Now we're allowed to do 4. This made a big difference because 3 just wasn't enough time, because every time you inspect the tank, you create work for yourself, and so it's sort of you're constantly falling farther and farther behind. So the state cut us a break on that. And then finally, the last time you have to inspect a tank is when you remove a tank system. You have to go make sure that the removal's done properly, there's no oil left in the ground or any strewed around, that somebody didn't forget and leave the vent pipe or the fill pipe hooked to the house. It has to be a final inspection. There is no inspection checklist for the tank removal inspection. So that's the 5 inspections: immediately after the installation, immediately after the first delivery to an installation, immediately after or prior to a delivery when you become a customer, once every 4 years for existing customers, and upon the removal of the tank. So those are your 5 times you have to do it. The inspections shall be conducted by an official inspector. To become an inspector, you have to be, number 1, a NORA bronze, gold, or silver certified technician, okay? Or you can be Vermont Oil Heat Certified Fitness, which means you're an a NORA gold, silver, or bronze technician who kept your NORA thing up with the state of Vermont, or with the Vermont Master Plumbers instead of through NORA. A certificate of a completion of this seminar, okay? So, and any other training approved by the secretary on a case-by-case basis. So basically, at the end of the seminar, you're going to be given a short quiz to prove that you stayed awake for the whole video. And if you pass the quiz, you will become a certified tank inspector at this point, okay? No, becoming a certified inspector, though, does not allow you to service oil burners, okay, or work on oil burners, okay? In order to work on oil burners, you have to be NORA silver, gold, or bronze certified, okay? You can't just go out and start playing with oil burners. So, and this, just being certified to be a tank inspector does not give you a quick shortcut to become a certified technician. The tanks that have to be certified or inspected, these are the things you're going to be looking for. These are what we call red tag issues. Okay, first is the tank foundation requirements that we talked about. Remember, existing is stable, new is solid. Pipe and fuel line requirements. Okay, existing, if it's in contact with or it's buried, it has to be sleeved or coated. Okay, on new, it has to be coated and sleeved if it even touches the dirt or concrete, not that it's buried under it. Okay, that you have to have an overfill or vent alarm. Okay, that's required on everything. It always has been. The tank and vent pipe size. Okay, has to be 1 1/4 inch. It has to have the design and capping requirements. So it has to be, the fill has to be a waterproof cap. The vent has to be a weatherproof, insect-proof cap. Okay, this next one's a big one, and this is the one we get more disagreements on. It's the one that tanks are red tagged on more than any other thing, and that is that the entirety of the tank surface and the tank legs are free of any cracks and or significant corrosion or pitting, rust, spores. The tank is free of dents and bulges, visibly impacting a tank seam. So a bulge on a seam, a weld, that's really bad because it's going to affect the integrity of the weld, and that would could fail. And also the tank fuel filter, the fittings, and the valves are free of drips or leaks or any sign of an actual or suspected release. So an oil stain on the floor underneath a fitting, that's a suspected release. That's got to be either fixed or red tagged. Okay. All unused openings have to be plugged. This is a new red tag rule. It wasn't on the old red tag inspection list. Now it has to have a steel threaded plug in the tank. What happens to tanks? Why do they die? Okay. And we find that tanks die from the inside out and the outside in. Now, the outside in is easy to see. You can look at the tank, you can see that it's rusting, you can see, okay, that's a problem. The problem is that it's also rusting from the inside out. You can't see that. Okay, so we have to sort of infer that from what we see on the outside. You can see in the slide here, there's 2 pictures. The one on the left is the outside in, and the one on the right, inside out. And the inside out, the whole surface of the inside of the tank is pockmarked with these little holes. And eventually one of them goes through and it starts to leak. Now, what's making this happen? What's eating the tank? And it turns out that it's bacteria. Okay, what happens is that oil tanks breathe. Okay, that's through the vent pipe. They breathe air in. And unfortunately, sometimes they breathe in air that has moisture in it, humidity. Okay, And basically what happens is the dew falls inside of the tank. And oil is lighter than water. So water settles to the bottom of the tank. And there are bacteria everywhere. There's millions of bacteria probably crawling around on the desk that you're leaning on right now while you're watching this. And the bacteria, they don't live in oil. Okay, they live in water. And if you get a little water in the bottom of your tank, if you get just a drop of water in the bottom of the tank with one little bacteria in it, by tomorrow you will have 1 million bacteria in that little drop of water. They breed that fast. And each little bacteria makes a little protective coat for himself. And where they live is at the oil-water interface, where the oil and the water touch, and they live in the water. They eat the oil. They think oil is delicious. Remember, oil is a hydrocarbon. It's a basic, the building blocks of life. So oil is, organic. And the bacteria think it's delicious. And so they live in the water, and they're eating the oil, and they're breeding like crazy. And they form this sort of slime coat, between the oil and the water. And you can see it clearly in the picture. In the picture, there's a beaker, a glass jar, clear glass jar. And we put tap water and brand new clean heating oil in there and just left it on a windowsill, open. And this slime coat, all this stuff that's in the beaker happened in 2 weeks. That's how fast it happened. And what we call this stuff is sludge. It's not a very pretty word or clever, but you could also call it tank bottom sediment or TBS if you'd want to be fancier with it, but it's sludge. And sludge is the picture on the right-hand side, the goop that plugs up the nozzle, the strainer, and the filter and makes a horrible mess. And not only does you make a horrible mess and plug up the nozzle, strainer, and filter and cause a no heat call, it also is acidic. Sludge is an acid, and it's eating the tank. This sounds like a cheesy horror movie, doesn't it? It's alive and it's eating your tank. But that's exactly what's happening with this stuff. And that's what eats up the tank. So we don't want water getting in the tanks. That's why you got to make sure your fill caps are tight. You got to make sure that the little plastic thing on the gauge is there so no rainwater can get in the tank. We've got to be real careful about housekeeping to not let water get in here, because water's getting in here anyway with dew. We don't want to let any more water get in there than is already developing. And that's why we put a drain at the bottom of the tank, so periodically you can drain the water out of the tank, because the water will settle to the bottom of the tank. Okay. And the other thing to check real closely, especially technicians, if you're watching this and you're doing a tune-up, check that filter can. The filter can is way thinner than it's not 12 gauge, it's a lot less. And what will happen is when you get a delivery, it blasts the little slime coat or slime layer into millions of little pieces. It floats up. The oil burner comes on, sucks a chunk of that sludge downstream, gets stuck in the filter, and then it starts to eat the filter. And in the picture, you can see there's a little tiny pinhole in the filter can. This happened in New York State, not in Vermont. New York State does not have a cleanup program like Vermont does. And this little tiny pinhole cost the oil company $100,000 because they were there 2 weeks before and cleaned it and didn't notice the pinhole. So this is serious stuff. So we can see some pictures here. These are tanks that are out there in the field, and they've been delivered to, and obviously they're leaking. Okay, the one on the left is subsidence. It's settled so much that the filter, which should not be outside, by the way, the filter should be in the building. Okay, but this happens to be a filter outside. The tank settled so much the filter is settling into the dirt. Here's a little hint: the first tool you need to change a tank filter is a shovel, you've got a problem. Okay, it's not okay. So that's not okay. That's obviously red tag. Tank on the right, you can see that the dirt is red. It's been stained. That is obviously not okay. And that's obviously not a stable foundation either, a couple of 2x4s. So a lot of these, this isn't hard when you go out and start inspecting. A lot of these are pretty easy calls. No, it's not any good. Remember I said that spores were not okay? This is a picture of a spore in this next photograph here. It's sort of like weird rubbery stalactites hanging off the bottom of the tank. What happens is this is a tank that's leaking from the inside out. It has a little tiny pinhole inside. and oil is seeping out of the pinhole. Not fast enough to really make a big mess, but just fast enough that what's happening is the hydrogen is evaporating, and it's leaving this rubbery carbon thing hanging down off the bottom of the tank. Do not touch this. If you touch it, remember there's a hole on the other side of it. And the only reason it's not leaking is this goop is plugging up the hole. So don't touch these babies. Just condemn the tank, replace it. That's the only way to do this. Okay. This one is another interesting one. This tank was painted, and what happened is it started to leak on the inside of the paint, and it finally leaked through and actually flaked, built up in between the paint and the tank, and then finally the paint chipped off, and you can see the bare tank. This is obviously not okay as well. But this does tell us something about the failures from the inside out. They're not catastrophic. They're drips. They start as being just little drips, and the drips get bigger. So we have time with these things. That's why you may think, oh my God, all the tanks have water in them and they're all failing this way. But they don't fail in a way that dumps 200 gallons on the floor. It happens in a way that makes a little puddle, a little stain on the floor first, and then a little puddle, and then a little bigger puddle. And we hope that we catch it. And what'll happen too is oil has a pretty strong smell, that eau de brontosaurus smell. And customer will notice the smell, hopefully call you on the phone. You'll come out, find out the tank's leaking, and replace it before any problems develop. Okay. The question about corrosion, significant corrosion, and this is really the eye of the beholder. One person is going to say moderate corrosion, somebody also call it significant. So I've got a couple pictures here. This one is the bottom of a tank belly, and you can see I would call that significant corrosion, where it's actually kind of becoming 3D. The rust is getting lumpy. Okay, that's not cool. Okay. This is another one, clearly significant corrosion. This tank, the paint it's come right through the paint, and it's all orange on the bottom of the tank. Also, definitely red taggable. Okay, so you're going to go out and do inspections. What you need is some way to prove you did the inspection, and we're going to give you checklists. You have these fancy checklists. They're going to look prettier than this, and they'll be a little bigger. They're going to actually be, each of these will be a page. But inspection checklists for each of the type of inspections you're going to be doing. Okay, so checklist is a form. It's pre-approved by the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, or your company can create your own checklists as long as it's been approved by the Secretary. Some oil companies actually have tougher standards than the state does. You're allowed to do that. You can have tougher standards. You're not allowed to have easier standards than the state. But if your lawyers at your company, has said, gee, you don't want to take a risk on this, you better, red tag those things. That's fine. You can be tougher than the state, but you have to have your form approved by the Secretary if you're going to use a different form than the official ones that we have. Okay. Basically, it just rates it's just a checklist. It rates the condition of the tank, its age, and what kind of shape it's in. And it identifies any issues that need to be addressed, and also includes a space where you can fill in what you recommended the customer do to bring it back into compliance. And you want to write that on there too. Say, okay, I recommended they replace the vent. It's a 3/4 inch copper vent. Well, the copper isn't really cool, but it's still okay, but the 3/4 inch is not okay. So you would say you have to replace the 3/4 inch vent because we can't deliver anymore. The customer's going to say, you've had a 3/4 inch vent in there for 30 years, you installed the tank 30 years ago, and you put the 3/4 inch vent in there. And say, well, we've learned a lot of things in 30 years, and it's not okay anymore. And if you do go downstairs when we're delivering, you may notice the tank walls will bulge out a little bit, because 3/4 inch isn't really fast enough to vent as fast as we're putting oil in. And so therefore pressure builds up in the tank. And the more the tank does this, eventually the metal is going to fatigue and fail. So that's why you need to get rid of the 3/4 inch vent. So there's going to be 3 different types of checklists. Okay, there used to be 2, you'll remember. We've added a new one, and we'll explain that new one in a little bit. Okay, So the first one is going to be for tanks installed before the new rules went into effect, which is July 1st, 2024. The second set of rules is for tanks installed after July 1st, 2024. So we're going to have existing tanks and new tanks. They'll be each have their own checklist, and the date will be the date that the rules go into effect. And then finally, the inspection form for new tanks, and that was the same form that we used to have. We've tweaked it a little bit, and I'll show you what changes we've made to that. So that's the three forms: new tanks or existing tanks, new tanks, and new installations. Within 5 business days of the date of the inspection, the tank inspector shall provide a copy of the inspection checklist to the owner. So these checklists are going to be 2-part forms. You keep one copy, you give the customer the other copy. If a new customer claims that the tank has been inspected and has a checklist completed within the past 3 years, you still need to reinspect the tank. The customer should not be providing that checklist to the fuel carrier. The requirement is to reinspect when switching fuel suppliers. Remember, if a fuel carrier contracts out inspections to another company and the tank fails upon fuel delivery, the fuel carrier, not the contractor that did the crappy job inspecting the tank, would be liable. And if you're an oil company, you don't have to accept the claim of the contractor. You can do your own inspection and see what you think, which I would strongly recommend. You can see actually in this picture, there's a young man that's doing the inspection. He's taking a photograph because there's a dent in the tank right here. This is no good. Dent right here on the weld, that's definitely a red tag. But he's not sure. He's a new inspector, so he's taking a picture. He's going to go back to the office, talk to his boss, and see what they say, because you've got 5 days to do this. Remember that the instant you do the inspection, you don't have to red tag it right there on the spot. You have time to go back, talk it over. Okay. One company, a couple companies I know have a 2-person rule. If you think it should be red tagged, you got to convince another employee that this is a red taggable tank, because you're going to make the customer angry when you red tag a tank. They aren't going to be happy about this because, as you know, these solutions aren't cheap. And so you want to make sure that you're getting it right and you're doing the right thing. Now, non-compliant tanks, existing tanks, if an above-ground tank is determined to be non-compliant, there's something wrong with it, okay, you shall include such results in the inspection checklist and take the following measures. You have to red tag the tank, which is put a physical red tag on the tank right here and on the fill outdoors if it's, and you'd really want to put that red tag where it's obvious from a distance, because you'd hate to have an oil driver back up a 200-foot driveway on a snowy day, then get his hose out, drag the hose through 3 feet of snow, 40 feet up to the fill, and then see the red tag. Make it so that you can see it from a distance, so the driver doesn't have to go to that much trouble to do that. And then on it, there's a checklist on the red tag that shows why you red tagged it and why it shouldn't be filled. And it should be hooked to the tank and the port, clearly visible in unobstructed view. Clearly, this is a picture of a really red taggable tank. Now, this is a suggestion I want to put in the middle. This is not in the state rules at all, but it's something that would make this flow better. And the state they've agreed to this. Okay, they just didn't want to write it down anywhere. But there's a point where you want the inspection to become a sales presentation. So you go out and decide the tank's non-compliant, okay, for whatever reason, okay. What you want to do then is give the customer an idea, okay, your tank is not compliant. Here's what's wrong. This is how much it would cost. Why don't we just get it done? Then we don't have to red tag it. We'll just fix it and you'll be good, okay. You're allowed to do that. Delay any scheduled deliveries. If you think the tank should be red tagged, don't deliver to it. But if there's some oil left in the tank, remember that's the only hard date on an inspection, is how much oil's left in the tank, because you don't want the customer to run out and you don't want to fill a tank that you don't think should be filled. So that's your hard date, is what it says on that gauge. That's the thing we worry about, okay. But if it's got a half a tank, it's the summer, we got some time. Okay, so what we can do is tell the customer, look, this is what we got to do. We got to get it fixed. We got to replace the fill or vent, or put in a vent alarm, or replace the whole tank, depending on what was wrong. And tell them how much it would cost to fix it, when you can get it done, and be ready to ask that question, why? Why are you doing this now? Well, it's been 20 years, why has it suddenly been red tagged? So, overpressurizing the tank on the 3/4 inch fill and vent. The copper oil line is maybe corroding under the floor and we don't know it, and it could be leaking under the floor. And you don't want the first time you know your tank is leaking when the oil shows up in the sump pump pit 30 feet away. That means that your whole cellar floor has to be torn up. You don't want that to happen. Okay, so these are the kind of things we have to watch out for. Only time I would really put a red tag, I think a red tag is a failure of a sales pitch, sales presentation. If the customer looks at you and says, no way, you're wrong, this is a ridiculous rule, I'm not doing this, I don't have that kind of money, we're trying to sell the house anyway, forget it, get out of my house. That's when you give them the red tag, saying, here's your sign. Okay, you just say, I'm sorry, we got a red tag, then I can't fill it, and nobody else can either. So there, nah. So, we'd like to really try to avoid that. You try to work with the customer and get it fixed. That's the goal. Our goal isn't to sell red tags or to put red tags on all these tanks. Our goal is to get tanks fixed, get them replaced, get them upgraded, get them whatever they need. And so we want to keep our focus on the goal. And if the customer is willing to work with you and everything's fine and you don't have to deliver to the tank in the meantime, don't even put the red tag on it, just get it fixed. Okay, red and yellow tags is what they look like. The red one says tank out of service, do not fill. There's also this yellow tag. You may say, wait a minute, what do you mean by that? We'll get to that one in a minute, okay? And it just asks for the date, the name of the fuel company, the contact information, the reasons why you red tagged it. That's what they're looking for on the tag. So let's talk about this new thing. The state of Vermont started having problems with this program right away in November. Okay, the rules went into effect in August, and by that November, what happened is we were out red tagging tanks so fast that we got ahead of ourselves and we couldn't keep up with the installations. And so customers were running out of oil before we could replace the tank. The tank was red tagged and they were running out. And that kept happening all the way through, because every November, the oil industry, we get insanely busy, and we're busy from November until March. Okay, and so it's really hard to replace tanks at that time of year. And so we've invented kind of a stalling tactic, and the state was this. It was their idea. They said there are some non-compliance issues that really aren't an imminent danger of a release. That there's something that should be fixed. The 3/4 inch vent, for instance, is a good one. But it's not going to. It's been 20 years. The customer's right. It's not going to start leaking overnight or tomorrow or anything else. It can probably wait till spring. And so the state came up with, on the red tag list of things that you had to red tag, they came up with a few things on there that aren't really emergencies. They aren't desperate problems. They could wait till spring. And that's what the yellow tags are. So we can yellow tag something, and it's a conditional fill. We can't just fill it normally, we have to fill it as slow pumping speed, and you can only put 100 gallons maximum in the tank. So that's the conditional fill. Okay. But this way we don't leave customers without heat in the winter. So a yellow tag is a sort of a balanced approach between the risk of a release, and we're taking a calculated risk there that these issues aren't that big a deal, for an imminent release, versus people freezing in their homes. So we're trying to strike that balance with the yellow tag. You may hook a yellow tag in lieu of a red tag for the reasons of noncompliance that doesn't constitute an immediate threat. It shall be affixed to the fill port and the tank, just like the red tag was. Yellow tags continued. Fixing yellow tag to an above ground tank found out of compliance with any of the items listed below is prohibited. Okay, so above ground storage tanks can be filled at the conditional fill, 100 gallons per delivery, slow speed. Yellow tags all expire May 1st. Okay, so this is literally just to get them through till spring. On May 1st, all of the yellow tags you issued all that winter expire. They automatically become red tags. After May 1st, you can no longer deliver to a yellow tag tank. Okay, does that make sense? And it can't be renewed. You can't yellow tag it, May 1st comes along, and then you go and yellow tag it again in July and say, well, we're good now until next May. No, okay. Once you've yellow tagged it, it's a one-shot deal. Upon exemption, and of course, filling an expired yellow tag is prohibited. The other rule in here is that yellow tags can only be attached to residential tanks. This replaces a standard that the state was doing. It used to be when you had a red tag tank that ran out of oil, you could call up the state, an agency of natural resources, and whine, okay? And you could get the customer to whine, and they may have granted you a conditional permission to continue to fill the tank, probably on some kind of limited way, until you could get it replaced, okay? The state has always been very uncomfortable with that. You can no longer get conditional permission to fill a red tag tank. You either yellow tag it or red tag it, and that's it. That's cut and dried, okay? And there's to be no more allowances if the foundation is not stable. It's a red tag. They're not cutting any slack on that anymore. So the tank has to be on a stable foundation for you to continue to fill it with a yellow tag. And that's really been in the law since 2017. So that's not like this is a new idea. This has always been the way it was. They're just getting really serious about it. So how does the yellow tag work? Well, it's applicable to existing systems only, not new systems. Okay, so nothing installed after July 1st, 2024 will be allowed to be yellow tagged. Only tanks installed before that. It's for residential only. Okay, the ANR defines non-compliant items which can be yellow tagged, and we'll get to in the next slide. A yellow tag issued by a tank inspector is based on the professional judgment of the inspector. You don't need to get ANR approval to issue a yellow tag. If you think it's okay, if you think it can last till spring on those the standards that are listed, you're fully empowered to issue the yellow tag if you're a certified inspector. The yellow tag is optional. If your company feels uncomfortable with this idea, if you don't like the 100-gallon delivery thing, or you just don't feel that you don't want to take a risk on yellow tagging a tank that is going to be red tagged eventually, you don't have to participate. Yellow tag, the whole yellow tag program is voluntary. It's optional. The red tag's always no break on that. But the yellow tag, you don't have to participate. You can just stick with the old red tag program. You don't have to do this at all if you don't feel comfortable with it. So here's the things that yellow tags can be used for. A lack of an overfill alarm, a whistle, on an outside tank. Think about it. The fill is here. The vent is here. The driver's standing here like this, filling the tank. Okay, he can hear the whistle, or the oil bubbling in the vent. Okay, he may get an earful of oil if his reactions aren't fast enough, but that would be the worst thing that would happen. Okay, so you don't really need a vent alarm on an outside tank because the driver's standing right there. Okay, you do eventually. Okay, so come next spring, yeah, you got to put the vent alarm in there, but you can wait till spring to do it. Okay, buried lines that are not coated or sleeved, because they've been buried under there since they were installed, God knows how long ago, 30 years ago, and they've always been okay. Now all of a sudden they're leaking? No, So we're saying, okay, we'll take a risk on that. But here's one, the driver, you may want to look at it, and if the line looks really funky where it disappears into the floor, you could red tag it if you wanted. So if you're worried about it, if you don't think that's cool, you don't have to do that. You don't have to follow that one if you don't want to. But it's always been the rule, if it's not coated or sleeved, it's still okay for now. But it's got to be replaced next spring. Fill and vent, not 1 1/4 inch. So the 3/4 inch copper vent is okay until next spring. You don't have to red tag it in the middle of the winter, okay? And fill and vent can be copper. They have to be metallic though. No break on that. Okay, so the PVC and the radiator hose, no, they're not okay. Moderate rust. Okay, so here we go. This is the big, most subjective term. Moderate rust on the tank and tank legs, not actually leaking, but just pretty rusty. The tank has to be replaced, but probably not till spring. And this is a real judgment call on your part. You got to just really look closely at it. Don't rub it or touch it or anything, because that'll actually maybe get started leaking. Okay, but take a good hard look. Maybe this is one you want to take a couple of well-lit pictures of, and share with somebody, to see what they think about your definition of moderate rust. On the other hand, some people can be too tough on this. You could have a little superficial scratch on the tank that's got a little rust on it. That's just a little superficial rust. And superficial rust, you could just kind of rub it off and put some Rust-Oleum paint on there and you'd be all set. If you yellow tag a tank, you are required to photo document all non-compliant tank components and save the photos along with the checklist indicating the yellow tag issues. The things you can't yellow tag, okay, the unstable foundation, a lack of an overfill alarm on an indoor tank. You got to have a whistle on an indoor tank. Unused ports that aren't properly plugged. Excessive rust, pitting, cracks, observed leaking or dripping, dents on the seams, those kind of things. A dent on the seam could be moderate or it could be bad. You must document and report the yellow tag to the non-compliant tank database, just as you would a red tag. You have to put the yellow tag on the tank and the yellow tag on the fill, okay, just like on red tags. You have the conditional fill, the 100 gallons per delivery at a reduced fill rate. And remember, they all expire May 1st. So on May 1st, yellow tags become red tags and they cannot be renewed. So we have a checklist here, and this is the checklist for the routine or new customer for an existing tank. So new customer, existing tank, okay? And be installed before July 2024, okay? And on it, you're going to notice that the form is different than the old forms in that it now has columns that say compliant, yes, for all the little issues that are noticed. And then it also says there's red tag boxes and then yellow tag boxes. And the yellow tag boxes have NA for things that are not yellow taggable. So for instance, on the top it says, is the tank on a stable foundation? Compliant, yes. Red, yes, a box for red, and NA printed in yellow. You can't check that box. It can't be yellow tagged if it's not stable, okay? So I think it's a little hard to understand it, but if you look at the form, I would suggest you have a form in your hand while you're watching this video. Looking at the routine/new customer inspection checklist for tanks installed before August 1st, 2024, you can see there is now a box for the age of the tank and a box for the tanks in a flood-prone area. Okay, you'll notice on there that there's something new that wasn't on the old existing customer inspection list, and that is the double wall tanks and double bottom tanks have to have that interstitial space monitor we talked about. Remember, it's a double wall tank, so there's space between the inside tank, or just the inside bottom of the tank, and the tank, the EcoGuard Granby tanks, and the outside tank. That's called the interstitial space. There's a little sensor in there that picks up if there's oil in there, and it pops a little alarm signal on top of the tank. Okay, so you have to check those interstitial space alarms, and it's a checkbox that says it's okay for delivery. If the interstitial space has failed and there's oil in the outer tank, that tank is red taggable. Okay, so that's a new thing. Okay, then within 5 business days of the inspection for either red or yellow tag, you shall enter the following information on the database for the Agency of Natural Resources. Okay, the name of the tank owner. Now, we don't care about tenants. This isn't between tenants and us. This is between the owner of the tank and you. Okay, so we want to know the tank owner, the location of the tank, physical address, not P.O. box, actual physical address. Okay, capacity of the above ground storage tank, is it a 275, is it a 330, what size is the tank? Okay, the name, company, and contact information of the technician that performed the inspection of the tank. Okay, the date of the inspection and the date of the application of the red or yellow tag, which could be 2 different days, a couple days apart. Remember, you got 5 days there. Okay. The reason you checked it, the reason for noncompliance, the measures recommended by the inspector to address the noncompliance. What did you say they had to do to bring it back into compliance? And for above ground storage tank systems that have been affixed to yellow tag, a written explanation of why you yellow tagged it instead of red tagging it. Okay, so you say, well, it's a 3/4 inch vent. We're going to, but you could say, I think this is only moderate rust. I don't think this is, heavy rust. So something to that effect. And then you put this all on the database located at the address that we've put up on the screen here. Okay, so what happens if you have red tag emergency? Okay, you can't yellow tag it, and we're back to they're going to have no heat, okay, because they've run out of oil. Well, you can do a couple of things. One thing you could do is you could put in a temporary tank. You could put in like a 50-gallon drum or a 20-gallon can or something to get the customer through. You can't use the old tank anymore, but something to get them through until you can replace the tank or replace whatever's leaking or whatever's wrong. Okay. If the repair or replacement, a temporary tank or the repair or replacement is not possible before it's going to freeze up in the house, okay, it's going to get cold, you can, under these protocols, do a hand fill. You can pour oil into the tank, okay? The hand filling, it has to be no evidence that there is a release has occurred or imminent. In other words, the tank can't be leaking. You can't pour oil into a leaking tank because it's just going to run out of the bottom again. Okay, so that's make it a temporary, take the 5-gallon can you're pouring in and hook it up temporarily. That's the way to handle that problem, okay? You take reasonable precautions to prevent a release during or after filling. So you could say, it's a little tiny leak. Well, there's things called magna patches, and you can hook the magna patch to the tank. This one's kind of old, it's not working very well. But you can, it's a magnet that sticks to the tank where the leak is that temporarily replaces it. Remember, a magna patch is not a fix. So far, the record I've found is 7 magna patches hooked to the bottom of one tank. Okay, this is not okay. You're not allowed to deliver once you put a magna patch on there. Okay, that's not a fix. It's a temporary, very temporary repair. Or you could put a drip pan under it if it's just a little drip. If it's an unstable tank, you could shore it up with 2x4s or ropes to the ceiling or some kind of temporary thing to keep it from tipping over when you pour 5 gallons of oil into it. And visible monitoring. So somebody's watching when you're pouring the oil into the tank to make sure it's not running out of the bottom of the tank. And then if the tank starts to leak, you got to clean up the spill. And if it's more than 2 gallons, you have to report it and treat it just like any other spill. So you got to take, this is a very, very conditional thing. What's scary is there's still about 2,000 tanks on the red tag list that have been there since the beginning, and we know they've been getting hand filled ever since then. So this is supposed to be for a week maybe, not forever. Okay. Okay. Now, what if you disagree with a red tag? Let's say you're an oil company and an HVAC contractor or plumber red tags one of your customers. And the customer calls you all upset and says, well, my tanks, or the driver goes to deliver and finds a red tag on the fill. What do you do? Okay. Well, you're allowed to go make an inspection yourself. And we came up, human nature is amazing. We ran into problems with this right away. Somebody started practicing fraud, on this immediately. Some clown went around red tagging tanks, giving people a special price and, and to replace the tank and take the red tag off. And all they had to do was make a small deposit to to get on his list. And of course, he was making it all up, never showed up, took the deposits and ran. Okay, so, and that happened like 2 weeks after we started the program. So human nature is what it is, So if somebody's abusing the program, and Agency of Natural Resources came up with an elegant solution to it, really. They just said they're going to just accept the last inspection, the latest inspection. So if your customer gets red tagged by somebody, you can go out and inspect the tank. And if you disagree with the red tag, if you think that they're being a little too picky, a little too hard-nosed, they're what you think is a little superficial surface rust, they're calling significant corrosion, you can disagree and just let the ANR know that you have a problem with this inspection and that you think the tank is fine and you're going to stand by it and continue to deliver to it. And if you're willing to do that, you can, and they will let you, okay? And they'll take it off the red tag list, and you're back in business, okay? Okay, new tanks. Now we're going to go into the new tank inspection forms. The new installations have to be installed with compliance with all the standards provided in the rules, okay? In the rules and in NFPA 31. If it's not in compliance with those things, the new installation, you should red tag it, okay? So this could be a contractor, a plumbing and heating contractor, install a tank at your customer's house. And they call you up and say, okay, come fill it. You inspect it before you fill it and see that it's not in compliance. You can red tag that tank, that new installation. Just say, no, we're not filling it, because it's not in compliance. They have to do this and this and this to bring the new tank into compliance, okay? And the new tank forms are modified to reflect this, okay? If it's, so if it's not in compliance, stick the red tag on there, do the whole red tag thing that you normally do. Tell the contractor, you got to get this thing fixed. Or we'll tell the customer to tell the contractor that they have to get it fixed. Now, they did say that to the extent that NFPA conflicts with our rules, that our rules take precedent. Okay, so it says right in here that that's true. Because you may have a plumber from out of state, came in, did an installation by NFPA 31, and he took 2 tanks together with an overflow. Well, and that's okay in here. It's not okay in Vermont. So it could be, he was following the wrong set of rules because he's from out of state, okay? We did some new additions to the new inspection checklist that weren't on the old one. Now it's required that the new system has a gauge. That was always sort of optional. Now any new system has to have a gauge, okay? For above ground tanks located outside the structure, they have to be protected from ice and snow with a roof or an enclosure or on the gable end of the house or whatever. And indoors, they have to be on the lowest floor of the structure. This is all checked on the checklist. If there's more than one storage tank, you have to have separate fill, separate vent, separate gauge, separate vent alarms. You can tie the fills or the vents together above the tank, and then it's one size larger going out through the wall. And flood-prone areas, tank has to be secured, and the vent has to be higher than the level of the flood, whatever that is. So the new installation first fill checklist, same deal as it was. No yellow tags on this thing. This is red. It's yes or no. There's no maybe on this. Okay, but they did make this really good change, which you'll see on this slide. We used to require 2 checklists, one for the installation and one for the first delivery after the new installation. Now we can put it both on the same form, and it just has a box to be complete. This box is to be filled in after the first fill for a new installation. And basically just ask, is the system free of drips, leaks, and other evidence of release? Yes or no? And did the vent alarm function during the delivery? Yes or no? If you check yes for both of them, you're good to go. Tank is okay. If you check no for either one of them, they've got to be fixed before you can okay the tank. It's still red. You got to red tag it. Okay? So this is a nice improvement. Just cleaned up our standards for us a little bit. Now, as I said, there are things that we didn't bother to write in the rules that are part of NFPA 31 that we just really, yeah, okay, we agree with these. So some of them are, and this is a new one. This is kind of exciting for a lot of people. There are compression fitting systems for fill and vent pipes, okay? And we never okayed them before in Vermont, but NFPA did. Now Vermont has said, okay, we'll let them go. So you can use compression fittings for the fill and vent if it's in receipt of a certificate of compliance from Underwriter Laboratories, UL. Okay, so if UL has approved this system for petroleum, you can use it. Okay, they have these systems for waste lines for water. They're not okay. It has to be, the gaskets have to be able to stand petroleum. So that is now allowed in the state of Vermont. This is a new thing. Okay, the fill and vent still have to terminate outside the building and 2 feet away from any windows or doors. Okay, so you can't be right next to a window or door. Fill and vent both. And they both have to be pitched toward the tank, so oil can't lay in a pocket in the fill or vent. They have to be pitched into the tank. The tank must be pitched toward the oil line tapping. There's tapping in the bottom of the tank, and the tank has to be pitched toward that. The pitch in both cases is 1/4 inch for every running foot. So every foot of horizontal, you have to pitch it 1/4 inch vertically. No fittings below grade in the oil lines, okay? Tanks must be at least 5 feet from any fired appliance. Okay, that could be a gas clothes dryer or a gas water heater or an oil water heater, you know, an oil burner, oil boiler. You know, they have to be 5 feet away from, and they've cleared that up. It's from the appliance, so anywhere on the appliance. It used to be from the flame, you know, wherever that was. Okay, tanks must be at least 2 inches from a wall. Oil tanks have to be freestanding. They have to be 2 inches away from any wall, and they have to be 6 inches above the floor or above the ground. Okay, so 2 inches from the wall, 6 inches from the ground. No compression fittings on fuel lines. Okay, so on fuel lines, you're only allowed to have flare fittings and threaded fittings. Okay, no Teflon tape allowed anywhere. Okay, because the Teflon tape gets inside the fitting, gets downstream, and plugs up the oil pump. No, malleable fittings, not cast. Malleable fittings are the ones with thin shoulders. Cast fittings have thick shoulders. Cast fittings are for steam pipes. Malleable fittings are for water and waste, water pipes and oil lines. All carbon steel tanks should be painted. This black paint is a primer. This is just a primer. You're supposed to paint these things, okay? Some color, probably a color that matches the house, and you can just use, you know, metal paint, Rust-Oleum or some kind of metal paint. Okay. We've seen many tanks that if they'd just painted the darn things, they would have lasted. They've got superficial rust that just kept getting deeper and deeper from rain. If they'd been painted, they'd still be fine today. The new checklist has some additions that were part of the August 15th, 2030 rule. Ever since the beginning of time, since we've had this, we've had a rule that by August 15th, 2030, the tank had to be on a solid foundation. We wanted to say solid foundation in 2030, or I mean in 2017, but we realized that we said that in the rules originally. It said it has to be on a solid foundation, and the rules were in effect in July. And so many people called and complained because they made it a lead story on WCAX that we were going to make all the oil tanks in Vermont illegal. And the state blinked. They basically said, okay, we'll want this tank to be stable for a while, and then it'll have to be solid eventually. And we said, how long is eventually? And they said, well, how about 2030? That's a nice round rule. So that's where the number came from. It's sort of well, that sounds like all these tanks will be replaced by 2030, won't they? Because this was back in 2017 we said that. Now we realize, well, maybe not. Okay, but unfortunately this date is still in there. It's coming up. It's getting closer all the time. And what they've done is they've added some new things to the new rules that also have to be done by 2030. Okay, so basically that's on the checklist, is asking about that. And basically we've just said that any tank installed after July 1st, 2024 has to have all of the regulations by 2030. So we're not going to approve a tank now that's going to be no good 6 years from now. We're going to say, no, now any new one, you have to build to the 2030 rules, okay? And of course the new tanks rules are a little more stringent than the old rules. And think about it, if the new tanks are installed properly now in 2024, they'll last, they could last forever. They could last 30, 40, 50 years as long as the homeowner doesn't do anything. The only thing that's really going to kill a tank in the future and would cause it to fail an inspection later is rust. That rust might start to develop on the tank, and then that would cause it to be. So we hope in the future that this whole program is going to become obsolete. We're going to make ourselves obsolete because we will have fixed all the tanks. That's the goal. Yeah. So that 2030 is an important date, and by then everything has to be solid, foundation. Okay, that's the 10% bigger, 4 inches thick. The fill and vent have to be Schedule 40 steel or brass. The fuel lines have to be coated and sleeved if they're touching concrete or dirt. We have to have the shutoff valve either at the tank, on an inside tank, or at the filter on a tank outside that comes off the top of the tank. Legs can't be longer than 14 inches. Outdoor tanks have to be protected from ice and snow, and they have to be anchored in flood-prone areas. And that we have a new inspection checklist that reflects all of that. There's no yellow tags on the new tanks. Okay, so on new tank installations, the routine new tank installations going forward, there won't be any yellow tags either. It's either yes or no. Okay, so just to kind of summarize this, you can see on this chart, it says it has the requirement, existing, and new. So stable foundation, okay for existing, okay for new. Continuous concrete or solid foundation, not required for existing, required for new. Fill and vent line minimum diameter, required on both, has to be 1.25 inches. Fill and vent metallic materials, have to be both. Okay, fill and vent Schedule 40 brass or steel, only on new. Okay, piping and fuel lines, corrosion protection, yeah, on all of them, but not crush protection. Okay, crush protection, in other words, the sleeve that's a crush-proof sleeve is on new. Overfill vent alarm on both, always been required. Shutoff valve we talked about. Tank leg length only on the new. Rust in tank and legs and pitting on all of them. Unused openings closed and plugged on new and existing and new. Gauge only on new, not on existing. Outdoor ASTs protected from snow and ice, only on new, not on existing. Manifold tank for each tank hooked together, that's allowed on all the tanks. You're allowed to manifold the vent. And flood prone areas required on new, not required on existing. Okay, now let's say you got it fixed. Okay, how do you remove the designation and get it back on the regular thing? Well, you can just go take the red tag off or the yellow tag off, the fill and the tank. Okay, and then go to the state database and get the tank off the red tag list. It's imperative that you do this, and a lot of people haven't been doing it. And as I said, we have like 2,000 tanks on the list right now, which is ridiculous. So when you have fixed the tank, you've got to tell the state that you fixed it and to take it off the list. If you don't, you could get in trouble, because if you fix the tank and you didn't take the red tag off, and then something happened where the tank, okay, it's an existing tank, and there was a problem with the vent, you replaced the vent, and then the existing tank, ice came off the roof and knocked the tank over, okay, that wouldn't be your fault on an existing tank if you took the red tag off. But you didn't take the red tag off, that tank tips over, it's your fault. So you're on the hook for everything that happens to it. You're not allowed to fill a red tag tank. And if it's on that list, it's red tagged, whether there's a red tag on the tank or not. So whenever you get a new customer, go to the list and see if it's already red tagged. Because it may be, and they maybe got it fixed. You go inspect it, everything looks fine. You don't realize you're filling to a red tag. This tank is on the database as a red tag tank. So be sure to check that. It's really important, and it could end up saving you a lot of money. Proper removal. Okay, let's say customer has, makes me shiver to think about this, but they've converted to another fuel. I can't imagine why anybody would do that, but let's say they've converted to propane, or they've converted to a heat pump, or they're going to use wood full-time, or whatever they've done. Okay, and you're taking the tank out. Well, you have to follow the same code, either NFPA number 1, NFPA 30, or 31, and 31 is the one we use all the time, or some other method approved by the secretary. Okay, you have to get rid of it though. In this slide, we have a picture of a vent pipe that's coming out of the basement of a house, outdoors, and the fill pipe, and they took the fill box off. So all it is just a nipple sticking out of the wall. And they stuffed some rags in here. Well, what happened was, this was one of those classic mistakes where this house was on 23 Pine Street, and about 4 blocks over, there's 23 Pine Avenue. Okay, same address, almost the same address. Driver went to the wrong house. He was a new driver, didn't know where the old customer lived, went to the wrong house, thought kids had been vandalizing this house, took the 2 rags out, swearing at the kids that must have done this the whole time, jammed his nozzle into that open pipe, and pumped 200 gallons into a basement. And there was nothing hooked to the other side. The only thing on the inside of the wall was this, a pipe. Okay, and what the customer had done in the meantime was finish the cellar where the tank used to be. They put a man cave, and they had beautiful sheetrock, and they had a big entertainment center, and a beautiful rug, and a big, beautiful leather couch, and 200 gallons of oil burst through the wall, knocked the entertainment center over, and slammed right into that beautiful red leather couch, and put 200 gallons of oil in that basement. The driver sweared the whistle blew the whole time. There wasn't a whistle in the building, okay? But the driver said, no, okay. And of course, the oil company was sued for an obscene amount of money, So take the fill and the vent away if you remove the oil tank, please, okay? Let's see, now when do you have to replace tanks if they haven't been used in a while? Okay, if the tank has been out of service for more than a year, it has to be removed. Okay, and the fill and vent shall be fully and permanently removed from the structure to prevent delivery to a disconnected system. The removed tank and piping shall be properly disposed of unless reused. That's the actual quote from the rules. During the removal of the above ground storage tank system, the tank system location shall be inspected for an actual or suspected release. Okay, the smell of oil in the ground, red dirt, okay, any of those kind of things. And if there's any oil in the ground or on the subsurface, you got to clean it up. Okay, the regular cleanup requirements required, you got to report it and clean it up. If they convert the type of fuel they're using, you have to, and disconnect, taking the oil burner away, the boiler is gone, they took it out and they put in a heat pump, or they put in gas, or they put in whatever, you have to remove the system, the guy that does the conversion. Okay, which drives up the cost of conversions, because you can't just leave the oil tank there and say, oh, don't worry about that. They've got to get rid of it. It's part of the cost of doing a conversion. Now, some people whined about throwing the old tank away. They said, gee, it was customer owned the house, put a new oil tank in 3 years ago. Then somebody new bought the house, didn't like oil, converted to propane, and you got a 3-year-old tank. You're going to want us to throw a perfectly good 3-year-old tank that's been sitting in somebody's basement away? Can't we reuse it? Couldn't we sell it to somebody else? And so the state changed their mind and said, okay, you have to send us a letter, you have to describe the tank, you have to tell us a really good reason why we're going to let you do this. But they can conditionally allow you to reuse an old tank in a new house. However, The unused fuel in the tank has to be treated as hazardous waste. And so the trick is, you really should burn up the oil in the tank when it's still hooked to the heating system before you convert. Okay, that's the best way to get rid of the oil. They already paid for it. Why don't you let them burn it? Heat up the house, until that oil is gone, then come replace the tank and do the conversion. Okay, because if you don't, then you got to throw that oil away, basically. Now, the state said, oh, well, yeah, normally we'd say yes. And the reason you have to throw it away is because of that acid stuff I was talking about earlier. Remember that in the bottom of that tank, there's a coating of oil, then there's a level of watery, sludgy oil with all the bacteria in it. And this is the really acid band. And then there's the hardcore sediments in the bottom, which are really acid. And they're eating that tank. And what killed that tank is that oil. And you're going to take that oil and pump it into the new tank? You will kill the new tank within 3 years. This sounds like phony baloney, but we talked to the Steel Tank Institute and we said, why are we having tanks that are 3 years old dying? And they said, are you pumping the old oil in? And we said, yeah. I said, well, there you go. Because new steel is more chemically active. They said this with a straight face, so I'm just telling you. Okay. They said it's more chemically active and it will corrode much faster than old tanks will. So you're supercharging the new tank with the acid that killed the old tank. So it's a really, really bad idea. But the state said, if the tank is actively leaking, I guess maybe you could pump the top of the tank into the new tank. Just the oil in the top, not the junk in the bottom. But they're not crazy about that. They said if you're going to do that, you have to treat the oil with fuel conditioner. And I'm just going to read off here what it says. Fuel conditioner has the following components. It has to have a stabilizer to keep the fuel fresh during the summer. It has to have a dispersant to arrest moisture and in the pre-existing sedimentation. It has to have a corrosion inhibitor to protect the tank from rusting. And it has a metal deactivator to protect the tank against fuel blackening from contact with yellow metals. Oil and yellow metals don't like each other. Okay, and we made all of our fuel lines out of yellow metals, so this isn't cool. So you have to put a metal deactivator in there to handle that problem. If you do all of those things, then okay, as long as you don't pump the bottom of the tank, you can pump the part of the tank that's full of new oil. You still have to get rid of the bottom as hazardous waste. Okay, we just have a couple of additional clarifications that weren't really clear in anything before this. The first one is that above ground storage tanks also include bulk storage tank facilities for oil companies that are used to store oil to be delivered later to a customer. These tanks are covered by federal SPCC rules, which are much stricter than our rules. So they're under a whole different set of rules than we are in this program. This is smaller above ground storage tanks. It doesn't apply to ASTs storing used oil. In gas stations and other places where they have a lot of vehicles, they use used oil. They have waste oil burners to burn the waste oil. Since an oil company is not delivering to those tanks, we are in no way responsible for or even know about those tanks. So those tanks have to be inspected by the guys that own them, and they have to watch the same standards. But oil companies are not required to inspect waste oil tanks, okay, because we're not putting stuff in them. And of course, we talked about skid tanks. Skid tanks, as long as they are mobile or semi-mobile, are not above ground storage tanks because they move. But if you leave a skid tank sitting for 6 months and hook a skid tank to a heating system, it ain't a skid tank anymore. It's now a immobile AST and is covered by all these rules. Okay, so if you're moving the skid tank, not covered. If you aren't moving the skid tank, it is covered. Okay. And finally, here's a slide about the contact people with the Agency of Natural Resources and the Vermont fuel dealers. Residential AST Removal Replacement Program. Your customers are eligible to apply for AST Removal Replacement Assistance if they meet the following criteria. The tank is located at a single-family residential property in the state of Vermont. They own the home and reside there year-round. The property tax bill must be in their name. Tank is used to provide heat to a single-family residence. Previous year's income was less than $75,000. The tank work still needs to be done. As a special note, tank replacement work that is done before an assistance award is made eligible is not payable. So you have to be sure that the customer applies to have the work done and gets approved before you do any work. Now you can find more information, including where to submit application forms, at the address shown on the slide. So we're all set. Thank you very much for watching it. Good luck with the quiz. Thank you.